Now, there have been both successes and setbacks for African-American men since that Million Man March 20 years ago. So what's changed? For perspective, we're going to turn to political commentator and multimedia journalist Ray Baker. Ray, thanks for joining us.
No problem. Glad to be here.
You know, even just in that piece, we know there was some discrepancy over the reporting on the number of attendees at the Million Man March 20 years ago.
When I heard it.
But I'm fast forward to now, where the current conversation is really centered around the deaths of these unarmed black men, Michael Brown, John Crawford. Wonder what you think. Does the increased media coverage of these situations, how is that changing the conversation about a problem that's long been out there?
One of the things I think it does for the United States and beyond is magnify this issue. For so long, African Americans and other disadvantaged communities have been saying we've been taken advantage of, we've been having a perilous relationship with law enforcement, but there hasn't been any opportunity for those who aren't a part of that community to see or believe that. Well, with the advent of technology, particularly our cell phone cameras, when we see this, when we see Walter Scott running away, when we now know that Rekia Boyd was shot and killed while a police officer was driving away, when we see these things, when we hear Eric Garner scream, "I can't breathe," not only are black Americans affirming this, white Americans can see it, and now the world.
And so you think it's become a more globally focused sense of outrage?
I think it is one. I think it's one that people of all shapes, people of all hues, of ethnicities, religion, everywhere across the world can see and respect. All decent people want the law enforcement to treat all citizens equally. And so when African Americans are saying for so long we're not being treated equally, many other, which we presume would be decent people, Americans and otherwise, are saying, we may or may not believe you. With this advancing technology, with the video of it, we're hoping that all of a sudden we'll see, okay, this is being as true as these African Americans have told us.
What's your take? Are other communities taking note?
I do believe so. For the fact that we're having this conversation here in this space on this medium tells us that there is an attention to this beyond the African American community and beyond simply just the United States of America.
I want to turn to unemployment rates for African American men, particularly. You know, 20 years ago it was 8.1%, 20 years hence, this past September, 8.9%. The problem has only not gone away, it has gotten worse.
Unfortunately, the problem is as American as apple pie, if you will. The idea of capitalism and market economics suggests that someone must win and someone must lose. So long as the United States workforce always relies on this idea that someone must lose, and so long as African Americans have been the losers of the United States marketplace for so long, then we'll continue to see numbers that look the same, whether we're talking about African American unemployment rate being double that of whites in 1963 when Dr. King convenes his March on Washington, whether we're talking about the 1995 Million Man March, or whether we're talking about justice or else, we don't see necessarily changes or progress regarding individual groups. We're seeing a continuation of the systems that are in place in America.
But you would admit that there's been some improvement. I mean, there are definitely programs over the last 20 years that have at least targeted hiring practices, for example. There has been some progress.
The idea of what progress is and whether or not there has been progress is based upon whatever metric one would like to look at for it. If we're looking at simply the disparity in employment, one could look back right there with those numbers and say, no, there's no progress. If one's looking at the individual achievement of various African Americans in various sectors of United States life and business, undoubtedly there's been progress in that space.
I want to get just to your thoughts on Minister Louis Farrakhan, a controversial figure to many. What do you think his message needs to be now, 20 years later?
Well, I think the minister's message is one that has to be based primarily in religion because he is a minister. And I think that it'll speak to those who follow the same religious context that he does. However, what I think about this gathering, which is so important, is the words of the executive director of the William Killebrew Foundation, which is a nonprofit foundation here in Washington, D.C., aimed at stopping violence. And the important thing he wanted us to take away from that is there is such value, such immense necessity in coming together with folks who will simply affirm your humanity. And so whether or not one agrees with Minister Farrakhan or not, whether or not one agrees with Reverend Wright, who was one of the speakers, or not, many in that attendance, many of the hundreds of thousands who were there needed to be there because their soul needed that nourishing.
Ray Baker, thanks for coming in and giving us your insight. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.